this is Tyler Provic with another General's Tent video, tyler.provic.ca. This video is a follow-up to my previous video where I primed this miniature. I thought it might be more interesting to show some actual painting steps using one of the new techniques I've been trying out on my Infinity miniatures. I like to try different painting techniques, kind of following the fashion as it were. And this technique is a wet-on-wet blending technique which uses glazes after the initial rough blend to create a nice smooth surface. To start this technique, I mix a number of shades of paint on my palette, 5 ranging from darkest to lightest. Because of the large surface area of this miniature and the smooth curves, I wanted as smooth of a blend as possible. The success or failure of this section of the miniature will greatly influence how people see the miniature as a whole. If I fail here, no matter how well painted the rest of the miniature, people will only see a poor blend or rough surface. Like I said, I'm afraid I may have done that in this case, but this is a wargaming miniature, and once I make a mistake, I don't really go back to fix it. It would be a different story if it was a competition miniature, but in the end, the main goal is to get a painted miniature on the table. The color is Vallejo Model Color Buff with a touch of sky blue added. I use black to darken the color and white to lighten the color for the highlight and shade, although in this case the shade will be the vertical area facing perpendicular to the light source, and the highlight will be the lightest area facing directly towards the light source. I'm using a zenithal lighting style with the light source directly above the miniature. I've started with my darkest shade on the vertical surfaces. This is the shade of the portion that I'm painting. I then move to my next layer color, and so on until I get towards the horizontal surfaces that are facing my imaginary light source. When switching colors, I'm not washing my brush. Instead, I'm dipping the wet brush into the next color, wiping off the excess on my rag, and moving to the next section of the miniature. This creates my blend, and although it is a little bit rough, I can tighten it up later with glazes. The goal here is to have a steady transition from dark to light. Even if it's a little bit rough, it's important to not overwork the surface. Working wet on wet, you can easily disturb some partially dried paint and make an uneven surface or leave brush strokes. I found the compound surfaces of the curved upper hull very difficult to determine where my highlights and shades would go, and this is what caused me to overwork the surface. Once I've gone from darkest to lightest, I will wash my brush and then begin from lightest to darkest. I prefer my paints to be slightly translucent using this technique. I even add matte medium to increase the translucence without adding too much water. I want to go back over the miniature a couple of times to build up the color and create a smooth transition. Usually I am dealing with a much smaller surface, and it only takes me 3 or 4 passes going from dark to light, then light to dark, vice versa, to create the color I want. After that, I come back with some washes and glazes to start tying the blending together and create the smooth look I'm after. I'm going to speed up the video now to a section where I've taken the miniature away from the camera, finished up the basic rough blending, and I'll start showing the glazes that I apply after the fact to smooth out the blending. So here we have the miniature painted on all sides with the initial wet blend and allowed to dry. Now I'm going to try to tighten up the blend to make it smoother, and also I want to increase the contrast from the darkest to the lightest points. What I've done here is taken each of my 5 colors and moved them to new wells in my palette. I've added 3 or 4 drops of water to increase the transparency of the paint, and now I'm applying it to the model, trying to smooth out the blending. For my darkest shade, I've added a little bit more black. Usually at this stage I'm finding that my contrast isn't where I want it to be, and usually I need to go a little bit darker on the shade. Unfortunately, because I tried to speed up the process using a hairdryer, the miniature was a little warm and the paint acted a little bit funny when I first applied it. You can see me frantically trying to repair some of the mistakes I made. I was having a lot of trouble seeing the difference in contrast between my light and dark. Although on my palette and painted onto paper, the colors I was using were very distinct from each other, on the miniature I just couldn't see much of a difference. I was also trying to still refine where I was putting my highlights and shades, especially in the tail area. If you imagine that this body is a bit of a plain fuselage, in the tail area I'm not quite sure where the darkest point would be. I think at this stage I start to see that perhaps where I thought would be dark would be more of a mid-tone, and I try to correct that. Once again, I'm going to try to speed up the video in order to show all the work I do. At this stage it's just refining the shade and trying to smooth the blend, keep things as even and clean as possible. It's often at this stage that I have to trust in my ability as a painter and continue painting the miniature despite being discouraged by the initial results. Often it is difficult to tell if there is sufficient contrast on the miniature when the rest of the miniature is still gray primer. The featureless gray seems to erase any kind of contrast in the painted areas. I expect that once the rest of this miniature is painted, the character of the contrast and blending on the top fuselage will be more apparent. This has been Tyler Provic for the General's Tent, tyler.provic.ca. If you like my video, please leave a comment, like it, or share it with some of your friends.